Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm a lecturer in early childhood studies at Bath Spa University and an associate lecturer at the Open University. I'm a trustee for the Fatherhood Institute and also an independent writer and speaker for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be exploring representation in the early years, inspiring you with guidance on ways to be more inclusive in your practice. And I am delighted to introduce Kerry Murphy as today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, Kerry. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for asking.
It's lovely to have you on today's podcast. Just before we get started, perhaps you could give a quick introduction to yourself for our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Kerry Murphy and I am an early childhood, I often air quote specialist because I still very much see myself as a learner. But I specialise in early childhood development and neurodiversity, particularly emerging neurodivergence. So those children with developmental differences. I'm a lecturer at Goldsmiths University in London. I teach on the undergrad, the postgrad and the PGCE, which is very interesting. I'm also completed my doctorate at Sheffield, the University of Sheffield, and I am exploring the pathology of autistic children's play and challenging this idea that play doesn't come naturally to autistic children.
Sounds fascinating. I'm sure we'll get into a lot of that as the podcast goes on. But to kick off this first episode with you, Kerry, I'm really keen to explore why taking a neurodiverse approach is so crucial in the early years. But perhaps we could begin by defining what neurodiversity is.
Yeah, so that is a big and a loaded question. And neurodiversity, it's a bit of a buzzword in early education at the moment, an important buzzword, but a lot of people are using that terminology. And it's important to first recognise that it doesn't just originate from one place or one person. It is something that emerged in the 1990s amongst autistic advocates. So with the advent of the internet, lots of autistic people found themselves on, anybody who remembers the days of MSN Messenger and AOL dial-up. So it was the days in which autistic people started to come together and really started to question some of the perceptions of what it is to be autistic. And Harvey Bloom, who is a renowned autistic advocate, actually started to really query some of the narrative around being autistic and this idea that finding out that your child is autistic is obviously a tragedy, something that should be grieved and something that we should be concerned about, and actually pushed back on that and said, you know, don't mourn for us. Being autistic is a way of being. And so that first of all kind of explains why neurodiversity is often dominated by autistic narratives, although that is expanding a lot. But one of the things a lot of autistic advocates talked about is the fact that neurodiversity in its most basic terms is this idea that we as humanity, all of humanity, not just autistic people, we are developmentally different. Our neurological kind of journeys can differ. And so while some of us may follow a typical trajectory, which would be referred to as neurotypicalism, others diverge from that pathway and they would be referred to as neurodivergent. So, for example, being autistic, ADHD, dyslexic. And the idea of neurodiversity is actually it's a biological fact. So it's pretty much a neutral term in the fact that we as humans are different. We're not all going to follow the same developmental pathway. And that's actually necessary for human survival. Where that links to early years is that those neurological pathways begin in early childhood, from conception to birth and early childhood. And it's about understanding development in a more holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really sounds like historically neurodiversity or neurodiverse people have typically been viewed through a deficit lens historically. How much has that changed in today's society? How much better are we doing at understanding the needs of neurodiverse people, particularly in the early years?
I'd like to say that we're doing better, but I think the reality, what I would say is I think on the shop floor, actual practitioners working with children every day, I find that that's where you find the most kind of acknowledgement that actually children develop in different and wonderful and unique ways, and actually we really need to tune into that, and we really need to affirm and embrace that. But I think from a wider stance, from a political, from a policy-based stance, I think we're still really far behind on that. We are still dominated and driven by the medicalized model of disability and difference. So basically, if a child's development diverges from what we would consider typical, we intervene. We see that as, okay, there is a problem, there is a concern, we must intervene, we must treat, we must cure, we must eliminate, we must reduce. And I think children are still very much exposed to that deficit experience. And then what we see within their early childhood experiences, sadly, is that we see strategies and interventions and approaches that are very much about how do I make you less neurodivergent? So how do I make you less autistic? How do I make you less, ADHD? Rather than going, actually, let's really understand that as a valid part of your development and really meet you where you are. So, yeah, I think from a policy perspective, the fact that we even still use the term special educational needs, which, is a very othering and exclusionary term, it's about actually your special educational needs. We need to ensure that you're at age-related expectations and that you appear similar to your neurotypical counterparts, which is obviously problematic because neurodivergent children grow up to be neurodivergent adults, and the kind of internalized shame that comes with that is quite difficult.
It's a really important point you make there about special educational needs, because I imagine that listeners to this podcast might be thinking about neurodiversity and what that term means. You mentioned that it's become a bit of a buzzword. They might be, how is neurodiversity different, and why is it so important that they do take a neurodiverse affirming approach?
So neurodiversity encompasses all of humanity and refers to the fact that, differences is literally a biological fact. Special educational needs is a policy-driven term, so it's something that is being designed by policymakers as a way to identify that those children that are not following typical developmental trajectories, the very definition of SEN is whether you are at age-related expectations, whether you are having greater difficulty than your peers. And the actual frameworks and curriculums that we have, both in early years and beyond, favour a particular type of child, a particular trajectory of development. And so SEN is about actually you're not meeting these conditions of normalcy, so you are not following that typical trajectory. And so we need to intervene to put something in place. So where it differs is neurodiversity is about recognising that all children have their own developmental pathway, and we need to understand that, and we need to affirm and honour that. Whereas SEN is about, well, how do I correct you? How do I make sure that you are meeting those age-related expectations? How do I make sure that you're going to reach a good level of development? Now, if we look at the good level of development, that entirely describes a typically developing child. So if you are non-speaking, for example, you are going to be defined as not reaching a good level of development at age 5, even if as a non-speaking child, you have alternative uses of communication and you communicate effectively via your alternative uses. So it's about really recognizing that neurodiversity is about neutralizing the way that we see difference, whereas SEN is about almost emphasizing it in order to correct it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think on a practical level, it's useful to think about neurodiversity in terms of neurotypicality and those ways in which practitioners can other particular children and all children to an extent through the certain forms of curriculum that you talk about. What other practical ways might we see neurodiversity and neurotypicality playing out in the early years?
Lots of ways, really. So I think the big conversation that I have with educators a lot of the time is that the very frameworks and child development documents that we use only describe one type of development. And what becomes very difficult for a practitioner is if you are within the setting, you are supporting a broad range of needs, but you have children who diverge from that typical pathway. It can be really difficult to know what resources and what tools to use is if everything that you read beyond typical development is presented as a problem. So one of the big issues that I really kind of raise a lot with practitioners is we often describe development that doesn't fit into, say, the development matters as a red flag or an observation checkpoint. And the query in question there is, why do we immediately assume that there's a concern? So, we often ask, what is wrong? What is the delay? What is the concern? Rather than be curious to ask, what is different? So this child uses delayed echolalia a lot. So they repeat certain sounds and phrases. And so rather than immediately thinking, well, that's not in the development matters, they must be failing in their development. Actually, does this mean that their language acquisition is different? Could this signify that the way that they are learning language is actually different? And I think when you move towards more curiosity-based approaches, that's actually really exciting to think, I want to learn more about echolalia as a valid communication attempt. And rather than ignore echolalia, I'm going to respond to it. So I think the biggest problem that we have is that if our documents that we actually rely on to help us to understand children's development don't include all children, we then continue to operate with that othering mentality, that binary set of categories of your normal children and your SEND children. And we're not then learning the strategies, the approaches and the techniques that really are well matched to children's developmental differences. And I think obviously another thing that emerges from that is language. The way we then talk about those children becomes problematic. And I often find it within my practice is that if you're talking about a typically developing child, the conversation can often be quite excitable about all the milestones that they're meeting and the things that they're doing. And if things don't make sense to the practitioner, if they're typically developing, that's still got that element of kind of like anticipation of where's their developmental trajectory going. When it comes to a child whose development has diverged, suddenly it's tense. It's, well, what's the concern? What's the delay? And there's that pressure on practitioners because of early intervention that we must do something immediately, rather than taking that slow pedagogy of, actually, let's just see what happens here. I might not yet understand it, but I'm really curious to learn more about the child. And so I think I feel like I've gone off on a number of tangents there, but I think our curriculums and our frameworks, the language that we use, if you treat neurodivergence as a problem, then it becomes a problem. And I think that can increase anxiety for educators as well, is if we're only talking about these children in deficit terms, then we feel more anxious about caring for and educating those children.
So, yeah, absolutely. I think part of that anxiety, as you mentioned, is the curriculum there. And this push towards school readiness that we have within the UK context, it seems quite restrictive for a number of practitioners who feel that they have to get children ready for school at a particular age and meet these particular developmental needs. So I guess to an extent, it sounds that curriculum and kind of broader political forces that we have are quite constraining to an extent. I guess there's a need for practitioners to go beyond that and really challenge and be curious in their learning and seek to develop a more proactive way of understanding neurodiverse children's needs.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this is something that I often work with educators on, is that we tell them that we want them to be evidence informed and we want them to be evidence based. But that includes being able to be critical of the things that they are provided with to support children. And sometimes I think practitioners feel like, well, I can't challenge that authority or I can't challenge that document. And it's like, no, if you're going to be evidence informed, you have to say, actually, is this bias? Is this favouring a particular type of child? Is this limiting to children's development? And I think, again, we exist within a sector where I think there's a lot of elitism and a lot of looking down on early years educators as not necessarily being intelligent enough to engage in these critical discussions. Early years educators continually blow my mind in terms of the knowledge base that they actually have. I think it's an untapped area where they actually, because are often required to think outside of the box because of some of the constraints of early years, it's there where we see a lot of the kind of lived experience of actually how do we support these children. And I think we need to be drawing upon sector knowledge a lot more to understand neurodiversity in practical terms. And so, yes, we can challenge the things that we're given if they're not fit for purpose, which I would controversially probably argue then they're not.
Yeah, that's a really important point to raise at the end there. I think you're right. The status of the earliest practitioner in society is one that's not given the credit it's due. And absolutely, there is a wealth of knowledge within earliest practitioners and a wealth of creativity in developing more novel approaches for working with children who are neurodiverse. But that's a brilliant place to end this first episode. Thank you for that, Kerry.
No worries.
I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Kerry, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Kerry Murphy. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in the episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.